All right, we are delighted today to welcome Bud Heckman and Katherine Marshall. The Reverend Bud Heckman currently serves as Executive Director of the International Shinto Foundation and Communications Director of Worldwide Support for Development. In addition, he is the co-founder and convener of the Interfaith Funders Group. He has served on the Interreligious Cooperation Task Force for President Obama through the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. And he is editor of an award-winning reference book called Interactive Faith, the Essential Interreligious Community Building Handbook. Katherine Marshall is a senior fellow at Georgetown University's Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and professor of the practice of development, religion, and conflict in the School of Foreign Service. She serves as executive director of the World Faiths Development Dialogue, a non-government organization that works to bridge gulfs that separate worlds of development and humanitarian affairs and religion. Her most recent books are Global Institutions of Religion, Ancient Movers, Modern Shakers, and Women, Religion, and Peace Building, Illuminating the Unseen. We are thrilled to have you both here. Today we will start our presentation with Katherine. So I'm going to turn things over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, and delighted to meet you all virtually. Look forward to your questions. Bud and I are going to make a few introductory comments that in a sense provide some context for these complex issues from our respective points of view. So, Bud, if you could go next and next. He's operating the slides.
Sorry, it's just actually freezing on me, so just no.
Okay.
Go figure.
Well, in any event,
there you go.
And the next one.
Yeah.
I'm going to start with two images. And if you move on to the next one. My initial perspective is the issues of global poverty and global inequality, which to my mind should never be very far from our minds, because the issues of religious diversity and what you do about it are intertwined in very complex ways in these broad issues of social justice and human rights. This second image is a reflection of something that we feel that we're up against, and I think Bud will echo that very much, is the initial image of interreligious relationships is of conflict and tension, and in a very practical way, there is a preoccupation these days, particularly with what's now called CVE or PVE, CVE being countering violent extremism and PVE preventing violent extremism. But essentially these questions of security are very tightly bound up in the questions of social justice and are never very far from religion. So if you could go to the next. For me, there are various questions that are driving my professional life at this stage. And the first one is taking these broad global issues, whether it's climate change or disease, Ebola, whether it is education. The first set of questions that I ask is, what does religion have to do with it? In other words, where is the religious dimension? Secondly, why is that important? Why should you care? The third is, how do you deal with the special complexities and diversities, including the emotional dimension, that come out in almost any discussion of religion? And then finally, what are the action implications? What does this mean? To give you my quick answers to these, the first is that every issue has a religious dimension, every topic. Whether it's very pragmatic in terms of institutions, people, or money. And it also has much more complex and intertwined relationships in shaping the way people approach problems. The climate change issue is a classic example. But we are living in a time where, particularly in the United States and perhaps even more Western Europe, many have been blind to these dimensions, or they see them through very distorted lenses. So they come to a question about religion very much with what they believe, rather than in a broader sense of of how these complex issues affect people in Laos or Indonesia or in Guatemala. So the religious beliefs and organizations matter, and they're important, above all because they are so important to so many people and so ingrained in the way they think. And this is very much a part of literature, of music, of people's worldview and thoughts. And that, in a sense, is the simplistic answer, or the simple answer to my basic question of why does it matter? How to deal with the complexities? This demands a very thoughtful approach, a need to establish evidence. We talk a lot about evidence these days, framing, and we also need to find ways to help people, whether it's in the United States or anywhere else, to appreciate that when you talk about religion, it's not an animal, it's not something particular, it's very diverse and very complex. And for that reason, each one of these dimensions has complex policy implications. So as witnesses to this, the issue of free speech and blasphemy is one we were talking about here at Georgetown this week, with an effort to try to balance or to see the ways in which you might balance free speech and blasphemy. Next. As you all, I'm sure, are well aware, these are not trivial or easy issues. And here are a few of the reasons that I focus on. The first one I call politics, politics, politics. And in fact, many people, for example, in the World Bank where I worked, were very hesitant even to speak about religion or to include it in data collection because their perception was that this is really about politics and power. And therefore, as soon as you touch it, you get into trouble. Most conversations about this topic, whether it's interfaith, interreligious, interspiritual, whatever you want to call it, get hung up pretty quickly on definitions of religiosity, which are elusive and contested. So what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about people going to church? Are we talking about them respecting their leaders? Are we talking about their core beliefs, the way they look at the sun or the way they look at their children? All of these are very complex. And I take, for example, the issue of family planning and think how complex a decision is about whether a couple uses contraception, but also a government's policies and even the United Nations policies, all of which are tied up in at least 20 different factors, of which religious beliefs are one. We're also living in a world where there are tremendous tensions around religious freedom and human rights, meeting after meeting after meeting, effort after effort, to try to figure out, what does religious freedom mean? Is it or is it not part of human rights? Is it consistent with human rights? Is it above human rights? Is it below human rights? What does it mean? And as examples of issues where there are particular tensions, there's family law, which is divorce, rights of women within marriage, children, rights to custody, and the whole field of gender relations is tied up more than any other issue in issues around religion. I mentioned blasphemy and free speech, a hot issue, and then the issue of reproductive rights and health, which is, again, immensely tense, immensely complex, and tied to religion. Next. So the topic today, primarily interfaith cooperation, and Bud will set this a little bit more into a historical context. But the point is, it is, in my mind, to both of us, a very important approach. And there are so many different initiatives. No one has a map of them. No one has done a full inventory, but they seem to be multiplying wherever you look. There is, though, and this is an issue, I think, for all of us, media skepticism about interfaith dialogue. It's very rarely reported, and when it is, it's often with a slightly sarcastic tone. And one of the questions is why? So one of the images is that it's mostly about talk. It's blah, blah, not about action. Sometimes it gets very much into esoteric elements of transcendence, etc. The fact that it's very often bearded men, and take a look at Bud, he's right here with his beard appropriately, but part of the point is very few women tend to be involved in religious hierarchies, and so you have photograph after photograph of large groups of black-suited men. It's also extremely difficult, even for the most intelligent and well-motivated souls, to evaluate the impact. And very often the results of interfaith work are not what was initially planned. It is unintended consequences. So those are just some of the reasons why religious tension tends to be reported on extensively, but interfaith cooperation gets very little good press. And this contrasts with deeply held convictions that diversity and efforts to address the fraying edges of social interventions are a pivotal challenge. Some people will even argue that they're the most important initiatives, the sort of civil rights issues of the 21st century. And among those people who make that kind of argument are Ibu Patel, the Interfaith Youth Corps, Diana Eck at Harvard, sociologist Peter Berger, people who are on very different ends of the spectrum, but all of whom are very interested in the very dynamic world of religion that we live in, the fact that plural societies are the nature of modern society, people living together, people changing religions, religious affiliations. All of those make for what is potentially either a very exciting mix, a creative mix, or one that can be full of conflict and tension. I think that's the last one I can. Okay, so just a very brief comment here on what we mean by interfaith. By the way, the words interreligious, interspiritual, interworld views are all used as well. And the definitions are very complex, and people will argue about them not for days, but for weeks. One of my views is that we obviously have interfaith, which would be Buddhist, Christian. We also have intrafaith, which would be Shia, Sunni, or Presbyterian, Assemblies of God, Catholic. But we also have something that I do as a sort of my bread and butter, which is trying to engage with non-religious groups on issues of common concern. There's a very wide range of contested approaches. Some people approach it from an intellectual, theological point of view, whereas others look much more to let's find a common issue. Like Habitat for Humanity, for example, says let's have the theology of the hammer, where we all get together and build a house. And then from that will come understanding and knowledge. I work a lot on a variety of global issues. So I mentioned before CVE, otherwise known as countering violent extremism. So efforts to figure out why there is so much conflict in the world, efforts to build peace, the climate change, malaria. There's also fantastic interest in trying to deal with the worst of the poverty problems that hasn't been addressed, which is sanitation alias toilets. There are all kinds of initiatives and institutions, and just mapping them is a huge challenge, not to speak of coordination. And money is a constant challenge. There's never enough money. Very difficult to get, tends to be very short term, and it's a headache for anyone who's involved. Next, I think I'm through.
Okay.
Or no, the path ahead. I think we need to tell the stories well. We need to learn from experience. We need to link efforts. Some people call that collective impact. I think we need to deal with what I call the angry beasts. In other words, the real problems here, which include gender, relationships between men and women, and LGBT issues, people's fear that religion is really about proselytizing, intolerance, and above all, indifference, people simply not caring. And I think we can also build on the links to other important issues, like Black Lives Matter, like feminism. All of those have a whole set of intersecting things in a Venn diagram of social issues of our time. Over to you.
Thank you, Katherine. I have a lot of respect for Katherine, and I've learned a lot from her during the course of time of working in interfaith relations. So she's giving you one perspective. I'm going to give you another that's hopefully complementary. And I was going to talk to you about 4 different things. One is just a short timeline of modern interfaith relations, how we got to where it is that we're at. Looking at what some of the key changes are in the views on religion and religious participation in the American context in particular, from data from Pew and Public Religion Research Institute and so forth, to talk specifically about one study that has to do with religion and conflict. Katherine touched on this in hers, but I want to make a particular point about it because it's something that I've run up to and against throughout the period of working in interfaith work. And then to talk about the future of interfaith relations and what I see is happening and it as a movement per se. So I got involved in doing work in the field of interfaith cooperation right around the time of 9/11. I was actually dismissed from a job I had. They had a catastrophic loss of funding, and a person who was in charge of interfaith relations for my denomination tapped me on the shoulder and suggested I go work for Religions for Peace. And I have worked for them and many other interfaith organizations over the past 15 years. But during the first run that I had with Religions for Peace as the head of their U.S. chapter, I actually did a lot of work with interns and other persons to basically find and get information about what was happening on the ground in the United States with regard to interfaith relations work. Of course, we've had periods of time in our history we can point to where there's significant cooperation between people of different faith traditions. You have Emperor Ashoka in the 5th century, you have the Cordoba experiment that you can point to and so forth. But in the U.S., one of the things that's often suggested is that this diversity that we have is actually something that's new. But we have traces of religious diversity from the very beginnings in the U.S. They say as much as, and then the figures differ, but as much as 10% or more of the population of slaves who came to the United States, for example, were Muslim. And you have an early mosque that appears all the way up in the Dakotas. You also have Jewish settlements in the Carolinas that are very, very early on in American history. And a lot of people came to the U.S. obviously seeking refuge from the persecution that they were experiencing because of their religious difference. And I think that part of what we need to do is help honor that. There's an excellent book by Peter Mansue that's come out recently that gives some overview of the great religious diversity that we've had that's been hidden from us largely in most of our textbooks throughout the course of the history of the U.S. In the 1890s, there was a seminal event, which was that during the Chicago Exposition, there was a Parliament of World Religions, and we have a modern manifestation of that because 100 years after the original one in 1893, there was a group of people from Chicago that worked for 5 years to try to institute the idea of a Parliament of Religions in a different frame. The original Parliament was a large swath of religious leaders from the East and West. It included women who came up onto the platform and spoke and addressed the Congress. So it reflected a tremendous diversity, and it also was an earmark in the modern era for what's happening. There were other manifestations, the World Congress of Faith, the International Association of Religious Freedom, and so forth, but there largely had been a lull until the 30s and 40s because the Parliament was a one-off event. In the 30s and 40s, you have a great deal of activity between different types of people within a faith tradition, what was called intra-faith by Katherine and is ecumenical for Christians. So you have the advent of Abrahamic organizations appearing in the U.S. and the local level. You have the great work that was done by the National Conference of Catholics and Jews that later became the National Conference of Communities for Justice, and the advent of the World Council of Churches. The 60s and 70s was a ferment period of a lot of things socially, the Beatles, the nuclear crisis, liberation movements, and so forth. But there are two things that I want to point out that are pivotal for understanding what's happening today in interfaith relations. One is the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act. And I understand that's been said that Martin Luther King actually pointed to this as saying that it was actually in some way eventually would be more important than the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And it's because it changed the formula for how it is that people can come to America. So you see in Diana Eck's research, New Religious America, the book that came out around 9/11, that book catalogs some of this. And so, for example, you have, prior to 1965, you have some years in which you have just as little as maybe 2,000 people coming to the U.S. in the course of a year who are from countries that are predominantly other than Christian or Jewish in their makeup. So you start having Cambodian Buddhists who are refugees come. You start having advent of people from other countries. So before 1965, it's a small number, just a couple of thousand in the course of a year, who are not coming from these predominant Christian Jewish dominated countries where they had historically come from in the makeup of the U.S. After 1965, because of the Immigration and Naturalization Act and a series of things that follow thereafter, we have some years in which the migration of people to the U.S. surges to as much as 2 million in the course of a year from countries where people are going to bring religious diversity to the U.S. The other major factor is Nostra Aetate. We just celebrated the 50th anniversary of it at the end of October of last year. And Nostra Aetate is a document that was part of the Second Vatican Council of the Roman Catholic Church. And in it, it has what today would be considered, I think, arrogant language, in which it talks about the Catholic Church as being the one great sun, and there being rays of truth from other religious communities. But it is the first formal acknowledgement by what is the world's largest religious community of the validity and truth claims of other religious traditions. It also included in it the idea or concept that the Catholic Church needed to formalize its relations with other religions, which in turn other religious communities began to respond in turn. So you have sort of like the impetus that it comes out of Nostra Aetate is that religions really ought to learn how to deal with one another. And you have a whole string of ripple effect of things that come from that experience. In the 1990s, the Parliament re-manifests itself, and it's a great big tent. Religions for Peace, which was founded in 1970, really takes off and finds significant funding from governments and foundations and so forth, and becomes sort of the first multi-million-dollar interfaith organization. And you have trends like the end of the Cold War, the expansion of transportation and communication, migration, the tendency for intermarriage and for work environments that increasingly put people from different faiths together. There's all these things that are happening that basically create for a greater sense of awareness of our religious diversity. And then we have a darker turn in the 2000s with 9/11 and people framing religion around the idea of conflict. And now today talking almost exclusively in a frame of CVE, combating violent extremism or preventing violent extremism. I'm just going to scan through a few of these because you all have seen some of this research, but you begin to see a variegation of the religious diversity that's in the U.S. context, where now we have 1/5 of the American population that is identifying as basically being unaffiliated, and the large blocks of Protestants that used to be a majority in the U.S. actually are dwindling in terms of their effect and power. And there's an interesting book coming out by Robbie Jones, who heads the Public Religion Research Institute, which is releasing now, called The End of White Christian America. And it delineates some of this data that he shows. This is a chart that they created in response to the controversy around the Coca-Cola ad during the Super Bowl, basically to show the differences between religious diversity experienced in age groups. So amongst people that are over 65, only 11% are identifying as being unaffiliated, whereas almost 1 in every 3 of young people under 30 years of age is. So you see that variegation in how it is by ages. It's also, you can see here the decline in the Protestants. There's also a significant decline in Catholics, which would be significantly worse if it wasn't for the upsurge in Hispanic Catholics. And statistics show us, I believe from Pew Research, that just a little over 40% of all persons basically switch their religious affiliation in the course of their lifetime. That can be from one tradition to another within a faith tradition, or it can be across religious lines. But we now have, as a result of these forces, which I mentioned earlier, a heavier churn of activity of interactions between religious communities and within an individual person of the possibility that they would be exposed to and involved in different faith traditions. You also have layered on top of that the idea of the nones and nons, people who respond, have trouble checking a box or check the other box in a survey. The research that Robbie and others have done shows basically that there's a great variegation in who these people are and what it is that they believe. So rather than just thinking that they're all a-religious, I would encourage you to look a little closer at the data, because you see, for example, here in this one data set that he's provided, it shows that unattached believers and secular persons actually understand that God is a person or God is an impersonal force. Further data will show that many of them actually have spiritual or religious practices, while they might not actually be affiliated or attached to a religious community, and might exercise them as regularly as other people of faith and attached to faith communities do. You also have this phenomena of people being, what I'll say is, have multiple religious belonging, or who are interspiritual. So one of the reasons why the term interfaith is problematic is because people who have multiple religious belonging, or who I label as interspiritual, actually refer to themselves as interfaith. Whereas when I speak about it, I'm often talking about a person from a faith tradition speaking to a person from another faith tradition, or to a secular person. That reality is being evident here, where you see that do you follow the teachings or practices of more than one religion? 16% of the American public is responding yes. And is your spouse religious different background than you are? 1 out of every 4 people, that's the case. And so that's something that has to be mitigated in families. And you have the advent of religious centers now that honor the different diversity. You have a variegation now as well in how it is that people receive and perceive people. The data that the Public Religion Research Institute put out and Pew has put out shows that Americans do not know Muslims very well. I think only 8% of Americans report that they have a regular relationship or have close knowledge of a Muslim, and more than 70% of them say that they don't know a Muslim that they know of, or that they have no regular sort of contact with them. So naturally, so you can see when that's the case, the thing that you know the least about and the people that are least represented in a survey will represent with more negative feelings. So I want to focus on this particular piece, because in the work that I do in interfaith cooperation, the thing that I'm most frequently confronted with is that religion is responsible for conflict. Unfortunately for millennials, I think that this is the case, is that they since the 9/11 era, they perceive that basically religions cause problems in the world and that they fight with one another, and the headlines in their news sources basically reinforce this fact. However, the Institute for Economics and Peace and Brian Grimm, who used to be at Pew and now works independently on religion and business working together on religious freedom issues, did a joint survey and a sort of mega search of data that had been done in other sources. So this is one stripe of that data where it shows that the causes for armed conflict, the 35 armed conflicts that were known in the world in 2013, they broke out what was actually a cause factor in them. Number one, religion is involved in only 40% of those conflicts and is a single factor in none of them. In fact, other issues such as corruption, gender, economic inequality, political instability, and so forth are actually leading factors for why there is a conflict. Religion is often used as a guise or an excuse, even when it doesn't have a role. Often it may be accused of having a role and not have a role, and sometimes its role may be distorted, whereas religion does have a role, but it's often misunderstood as to what exactly the role is that religion has. Also, the proportion of religious belief that's in a country doesn't determine peace. Countries that are higher in religious membership and have greater diversity of religions, like the United States, tend to be slightly more peaceful, but that's only negligible in terms of the results of the data. And the demographic spread of Shia and Sunni is not a determinant of peace. They looked specifically at a lot of the places where the percentages were imbalanced between Shias and Sunnis and so forth. While there's much attention around this issue, it has to do with the conflict in the northern part of Africa right now. It doesn't play out in other parts of the world and in other conflicts. Finally, I just want to make some summative comments about my understandings about what the case is with regard to interfaith relations as a movement. I've been arguing that it is as important as a movement as other movements are, such as the rights for women, for human rights in general, for civil rights, for the environment, and other things. and that it has actually been in its infancy, and it's really only a few decades old, and has only been sharply coming into focus as a movement in the past couple of years. So that organizations become clearer and more focused and more mainstreamed in terms of the work that they did. When I first got involved in this business, there was really a lot of fuzziness, I have to say, and I think a lot of organizations have become much, much sharper and more precise about what they're doing. That the Academy recognized the value of interfaith and interreligious. That's happened with the Association of Theological Schools, creating criteria that basically say theological schools have to be responsible for how it is that they're preparing people for a religiously diverse world. That language has now been inserted in their criteria. The American Academy of Religion a few years ago creating the Interfaith and Interreligious Studies Group, which formalizes the study of interfaith as an enterprise within religion, something that had been argued by presidents and leaders of the American Academy of Religion for some time. That governments and intergovernmental entities continue to recognize and integrate approaches. Just in the period of time that I've been working in this enterprise, I've witnessed the explosion of the interest of governments in getting involved. You have the US government that got involved in a big way with the Office of Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships and a significant expansion of that, and it under multiple entities, and now a new very large unit within the State Department. You have governments like Denmark, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc., Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, so forth, across the globe that are trying to invest funds in advancing interfaith work and see it as a tool because, as President Obama had said, basically religious communities dwarf the capacity of governments to basically make good on social causes. And then funders. This is the area that I specifically work in, and I've tried to help. I work for a foundation that funds interfaith cooperation. And I've helped to form what's called the Interfaith Funders Group, which is a consortium of foundations and donors that are interested in advancing it as a movement. As a person who has worked in a few different foundations, one of the things that we've tried to do is to help fund the images of religious diversity to be in the mainstream. So this is sort of like trying to have people who are the religious other be able to have their Cosby Show moment within the context of Hollywood and regular sort of TV world, so that there might be shows that depict, for example, if there's a show that's about cops, that one of the cops be portrayed as being a Muslim and in a constructive and positive way, so it shows how he lives out his faith. Right now, most of our things that we consume through movies and TV and so forth are actually sanitized from religion, or if religion is inserted, it's often in a very stereotyped and actually unhelpful frame for understanding the way that religion is part of people's lives. And finally, the various actors working on defining what the winning words and persuadable audiences are. And the analogy here is that the people in the LGBTQ movement basically for a long period of time talked about rights. And they found basically by doing surveys and focus groups that actually was working against them to speak in that frame. And that if they actually worked to try to expose people who were against gays and lesbians or same-sex marriage or what have you, that they were able to actually demonstrate to them and expose them to someone who had such a person in their family, and to develop some empathy for them, and to ask or invite them to consider how they might have such persons within their own extended family and so forth, that they could be much more successful. And the people that are working to help combat Islamophobia in the US have done similar types of research to find things such as, from surveys and focus groups, that they need to stop saying Muslim American and say American Muslim. Why? Because people are much more likely to continue to listen to you if you say American Muslim than Muslim American. That sounds stupid, but what the thing is that you're using the right types of words to basically continue to engage people in conversation and to help bring them to a persuadable point about what it is that you want them to see, which is the value of Muslims and of the Islam faith and the positive aspects of it. So these are the types of insights, and I think that this type of sort of research and application has not yet been applied to religious diversity as a whole, and it's something that I'm been interested in working on, is basically to try to find the right ways to speak about it. The very term interfaith that we have is a problematic term because it's just confusing and meaningless to people. Although it comes up big in Google search, it doesn't help in terms of you always have to explain it. So.
Tiffany, we can't hear you.
Oh, Tiffany, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, y'all. I was trying to be a good steward and not interrupt. Anyway, I was about to tell you. Thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and move on to Q&A sessions now. And Katherine, you're unmuted as well since the echo situation is gone. I'm going to start with the first question. I attended a conference this year and a speaker's comment caught me off guard. The session was not kind toward Muslims. How common is the idea that interfaith efforts, specifically those initiated by mosques, are just a ruse that allows extremism into America? Is this something you hear about?
I've never heard it in that form, I have to admit. Most of the interreligious or interfaith activities I'm involved in are international rather than domestic. What you do see, though, and I would highlight this, is the extraordinary vehemence that you find in online responses to blogs or to columns that are written by or that focus on Muslim issues. It is quite frightening, the level of anger that you hear. But you probably have a clearer notion of this within an American context.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure of working specifically with the Muslim community and trying to help combat Islamophobia in the U.S. Through my previous work. And I started an initiative called Our Muslim Neighbor, which focused on Central Tennessee, because a lot of the people that tried to challenge the Ground Zero Mosque packed up their stuff and went to Central Tennessee to try to attack that area next, because they felt like they would have common friends who would help support them. And there is a study that I would encourage you all to take a look at that's now had a second rendition that was done by Wajahat Ali and others at the Center for American Progress that has to do with the Islamophobia industry in the United States. That is a small number of foundations, 7 very conservative foundations that provide a significant amount of funding to a handful of actors and organizations that put out false information basically about Muslims and Islam. And the specific tactic that the person is mentioning in this chat question is exactly what happens, that they perceive that things are a ruse, that the effort, that there's really another intention, that there's another reality beyond what we see in terms of interacting with people on the ground in the mosque. And it's just simply not true. I would encourage you to look at the study, though, that's by the Center for American Progress on Islamophobia in the U.S.
Okay, our next question. As Katherine noted, it can be hard to capture the work of interfaith groups in an article. Any more tips or even topic suggestions for those of us who want to keep trying?
One thing that seems to be universally difficult is to make meetings interesting and exciting. They can be, and the people who participate in them can emerge with the sense that there's been some transformation or some true enlightenment or new, fresh insights, but conveying those, particularly when you're negotiating something that everyone will agree to, tends to be very difficult. I think the most interesting stories about interreligious engagement do turn around practical issues, whether it's, I think that Habitat for Humanity, I saw they just got some big award. Yep. And they mobilize over 1 million volunteers a year. They have a very strong Christian base, but they're also looking a lot at interreligious, but they've actually articulated the notion of the theology of the hammer. And there are a lot of other interesting efforts to bring religious groups together around very practical tasks, malaria, sanitation. What I frankly would like to see much more, and if you find any stories, these are ones that are worth trumpeting, are on some of the tougher issues, but that really shouldn't be that tough, like gender-based violence or violence against women. We now know from studies that this is extraordinarily common. That it is in all parts of the world, in all traditions, and all economic strata. And it's very well documented. There are all kinds of studies. I would have thought that this would be a powerful impetus for religious communities to take this up and say, we're going to bring this to an end. But it's a bit tepid, the response. And likewise, child marriage or forced marriage or some of these other issues. There needs to be something that fires people up. And when you find people who are fired up, to get them involved. I'm involved right now in an effort to try to mobilize religious communities and leaders on the issue of hunger, which is another sort of no-brainer. But again, I think that the stories that translate the pictures of smiling people in interesting costumes with too few women into the realities of what it actually looks like when you're grappling with a problem that is a genuine problem. Those are the ones that move people and that really make a difference.
I'd say that there are some nodes that are out there where you can gather information that I think is quite interesting. That Katherine's done like 400 some odd interviews with people that are religious actors around the globe, and they're all cataloged on the Berkley Center website. They're very rich and deep in terms of the perspectives and so forth they do. And they also do research and reports and have conferences and symposium there at the Berkley Center. The stuff that comes out of that is quite rich, that shows examples of what's happening on the ground. I also turn each month to a handful of different resources, one of which is the Interfaith Observer, which is produced by Paul Chafee out in San Francisco. It's a great capture of things that are happening everywhere, basically, that have to do with interfaith cooperation. So there are these places you can get nodes of information, basically.
Okay. Next question from Michael Schulzen. He says, thanks for this fascinating presentation, but confession, I'm sometimes a media skeptic of interfaith dialogue. I worry that presenting a religious tradition for consumption by those of another faith, as opposed to just living it out alongside them and discussing points of intersection or tension as they emerge, can lead to a very artificial presentation of a tradition, often packaged using the terms of the culturally dominant tradition, for example, Christianity. How can leaders address that artificiality? How should journalists? Or is my observation off base?
Well, there is a difference, I think, generationally here. In the work that I had done with the Religions for Peace in particular, I observed that persons that are, say, 40, 50 years of age and older all have a preference and experience with dialogue, specifically as being the initial frame for which they entered into interfaith cooperation. And persons 40 some odd years of age and younger tend to have a great preference for doing work together. And it's sort of the interfaith youth corps modality, whereas let's do service together, then afterwards we might have a conversation about what motivated us to do it and why we come to that frame from our own interpretation of our own sort of faith streams. So I think that just has to be acknowledged, that there's a generational difference really in that. And I've found over the course of time that I have a preference towards the let's do practical things together based on shared values. But I can't get away from the fact that there are results that there are insights, that there are relationships that are built out of those older and sometimes boring dialogues that are helpful.
Well, there are all different kinds of approaches, and if you're dealing with theologians, they really do want to try to deal with theological issues, scholars, etc. Whereas for people who are involved in a conflict where people are killing each other, they have a different starting point, and trying to figure out whether in fact they're killing each other because somebody stole the land or because there's a deep resentment that's been passed on from parent to child and in schools and in textbooks. I think trying to sort it out is important. I guess I don't quite see the generational issue as much as Bud does. I know that in the worlds that I worked in, the international development world, there's a basic skepticism about dialogue. Because to them, dialogue just means blah, blah, talk, and it's the opposite of action. And they would even rather have something like debate. Let's figure out whether Judaism has some better policies or approaches towards X, Y, or Z than something else. But I realized, and I came to learn this because I came a little bit late to this religious perspective, that dialogue, in fact, means an openness to transformation. That's the understanding in a religious context. And it is a very different kind of engagement, one we have too little of. So if there is an authentic effort to learn about others, to listen, to find ways that result in something better, it can be an almost miraculous process. It certainly is one that is very admirable. But I think in terms of reporting or in terms of getting together, I mean, one of my favorite projects is in Ghana, where there was a crusade against filth. That was Muslims who agreed to call it the Crusade Against Filth, where religious leaders got together to clean up the city. And it was for a sporting event. But what was interesting about that is that they got to know each other. They had their cell phones. They had their cell phone numbers. So when there was a dispute around the election, the group was able to get together and to head off violence. So that's what I mean by unintended consequences. And I don't remember that they talked at all about anything theological. They may have in the dark of the night, but the basic purpose was to solve problems that they saw, whether they were sewage or killing each other.
Yeah. I think the majority of the time action leads to dialogue, dialogue leads to action. There are examples where it's exclusive and it's only dialogue or it's only action.
All right, someone else wants to build upon, and there's actually a couple build-upons here coming through the chat. One is to build upon the question of interfaith work and cooperation. And is there a way to, whoops, sorry, my screen just got down a little lower. Is there a way to address that without glossing over the very real differences in each faith? How do you present interfaith work and cooperation without glossing over those differences among the faiths?
Well, let me start. I'm sure Bud will have something. One of the questions, let's just take one of the third rail issues, abortion, or even, believe it or not, contraception, which can be a very divisive issue when you get a group of people whose primary focus is religious sitting around a table. So very often the approach to that is let's try to find something where we can all find common ground. So for example, let's talk about the orphan issue, or let's talk about violence against women, or let's talk about something even further removed. And then as people get to know each other, find ways to come to some of the more contentious issues. And now one result of that, if it's not well managed, is that you can just avoid the topics that are really important to people and that are dividing them. But I think there's quite a bit of good experience with that, as long as somewhere in people's minds there are the basic issues. Plenty of I actually would hazard, without a statistical framework, that a good majority of those issues turn around relationships between men and women. And of course, LGBT issues now, because those seem to be issues where religious beliefs and teachings and the models of leadership, models used very broadly, seem to be fueling some of the social tensions and backlash around those issues, not only in other countries, but of course in the United States, witness the political campaigns. So I think tactically, starting with the most difficult issues is simply not going to work. So most people don't do that. But when you actually start with issues that are related, you can sometimes get to them. And sometimes you really can make progress.
Okay. But did you want to add anything to that before we go on?
Go ahead. Let's get some more questions in.
Sure. In her presentation, Katherine talked about the tendency to dismiss the power of religion and argue instead that it's really politics. In his presentation, Bud talked about the need to challenge the narrative that religion is responsible for conflict and recognize that religion is just one factor, among many, that sometimes causes conflict. So what are ways we can take the power or importance of religion seriously without reinforcing the narrative that religion causes conflict?
These are all great questions, and they provoke lots of thought as well as answers. There are very few issues, to my mind, that are either religious or not religious. And remember that religion is philosophy, it's what you eat, it's what you think about when you get up in the morning, what books you refer to when you're looking for inspiration, who you trust. So just to start with that last one, there are a lot of surveys that give you choices of who you trust, whether it's police or government officials or NGOs or whatever. And in many parts of the world, the religious leaders are right up there, number one or number two, in the levels of trust. So, but of course, that doesn't mean that all religious leaders are trusted. It simply means that there is, in general, a sense that these people in religious communities are part of the glue and the fabric of society. So the first thing I think is to avoid any of these simplistic explanations. I actually am very distrustful of Brian Grimm's numbers because I think it's very difficult to calculate that kind of thing. And I work in various places, including Nigeria and Senegal and Mali and Kenya, where there's so many different factors that go into tensions and conflicts that even to try to put a percentage on the religion is sort of nonsense because it's so tied up in everything else. So I think maybe one of the answers to all of this is to learn to love complexity and ambiguity and to be willing to go into it and to say, okay, why in Nigeria do you have the president of the country saying religion has nothing to do with Boko Haram and nothing to do with the violence at the same time that surveys of people say religion is one of the most important factors? So that's a whole story. What's going on? Why is one saying something that sounds totally opposite of what the other is saying? What is it that they're perceiving? And I think then you start to get into the rich complexities of it all.
Well, you have this ongoing argument that people who are responsible for violence in the name of religion are motivated by their religion to do it. And other people say that they actually have other reasons for actually doing it. Religion may be, as part of Katherine's consideration of complexity, one of the things that's given consideration, but it's given too much of a highlight. I was actually moved by listening to General Douglas Stone, who was in charge of all of detainees in Iraq and surrounding territories following the fallout from the Abu Ghraib prison situation. He's actually a sociologist from California, and he did sociological studies as the general is in charge of all detainees on the people that are captors. And he basically asked them a whole series of questions, trying to determine their familiarity with the Quran, trying to understand how many times they prayed a day, how often they went to mosque, and so forth. And what you see amongst those people who were actually captured and the people that then eventually gave birth to what is now ISIS, and before that other things that we're dealing with in the world, they were largely ill-knowledgeable, largely unparticipating in their religious community, and they couldn't name or place, Quranic verses and so forth. They were people who were not educated, and it wasn't their initial motivation. It was something that they learned afterwards, having other frustrations and angers in their life about economic inequality, the incapacity to get a job, the oppressive and corrupt systems that they lived under and so forth, that they then layered this religious meaning to give purpose to something that they were feeling inside.
Okay, so I have one more question for you both today. This one's from Esteban Garcia. He said, is elevating religion when it is a stated cause of a conflict the best avenue toward peace? In the case of Israel and Palestine, for example, is interfaith cooperation in which rifts between Jews and Muslims in the region addressed more effective and focusing instead on purely the political solution? Jews lived peacefully in many Muslim-majority countries until the creation of Israel and the start of the occupation, and many argue that it was Israel's aggression that has fomented a maybe dormant anti-Semitism in those countries, and not the other way around, anti-Semitism being the cause for anti-Israel sentiment. In other words, is talking about religion necessary for peaceful resolution of conflicts?
Well, the person that was my mentor, Bill Vinley of Religions for Peace, frequently said, if religion is part of the problem or it's perceived to be a part of the problem, it has to be a part of the solution. And he pointed to a long string of efforts basically to try to make an impact on the situation of Palestine, Israel, where just like American television, they stripped out and avoided any interaction with religion, religious leaders, religious actors, religious frames for what it is that the problem was, and tried to look purely at a political frame for doing that. We know exactly how successful that's been to date. So actually, I think it has to be given part of the consideration, and that religion needs to be part of the formula. There's a lot of great examples around the world where sort of like a second-order diplomacy has happened with religious leaders when political leaders can no longer meet, can no longer advance peace because of a variety of factors. But religious leaders who may hold the same sort of weight are actually able to meet or advance talks and to work cooperatively sometimes with political leaders in order to be able to do that. So I think they have to be a part of the solution.
I think that there are at least two different, well, there probably are 50 dimensions, but let me at least talk about two of them. I mean, the first in the question is talking about religion and naming it. I think a recognition of the complexity of motivations and the different factors is important. You know, if people are angry about corruption, let's talk about corruption and talk about it with a view to trying to do something about it. If it's religion, what is it? Is it tensions around holy sites? Is it the fact that people don't know each other or have a level of ignorance that it's religious literacy, which is arguably one of the problems here. I think from an operational point of view, though, what people focus on more, and that I think is useful and constructive, is trying to engage the religious leaders who are either fanning the flames or who potentially can do something. And that's in the Middle East situation where people are constantly saying that the religious figures are barely, if at all, a part of the peace processes, with very few exceptions. I have heard David Saperstein and David Rosen, two leaders, say that when the Camp David Accords were signed, there was no one who was recognizably religious who was in any way part of that. And efforts like the Alexandria process, which involved very senior religious leaders, have not had the kind of support that might have translated a promising set of initiatives into something real. So I think that either talking about religion or just having religious leaders there is not enough. What you need is to be trying to get them to focus on the issue. So I know in the Middle East, for example, there really is an effort to deal with the holy sites, which is one of the big issues of contention. And there should also be plenty of other initiatives, some of them that would have a religious dimension and some of which would not. But I think that the basic point is that pretending religion is not there with blinders that have been characteristic is a recipe for getting into trouble.
Yeah, the Marrakesh Declaration recently is another example of that, where you have a very large number, very diverse number of Muslim leaders and other religious leaders and so forth signing on to a declaration and a process that's basically trying to help protect religious minorities in places where they're being persecuted.
Okay. Well,
doesn't get as much attention as what it needs to. So, sorry.
No, that's all right, Bud. With that, we are actually officially out of time, but I wanted, before we click off, to thank Katherine and Bud once again for this fascinating discussion. There's lots of wonderful things being said about you in the chat window, which I hope you can catch before we officially end this webinar. And to our esteemed Handa Fellows, I look forward to seeing you all again in May, and I hope you guys have a terrific rest of the afternoon. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you all.
Thanks, Katherine. Thank you.
Bye now.